while I want to say we have entered into the more eerie side of Ennis, in all honesty, it is just the indigenous side. What's good, y'all? It's your guest, sis Erica Vane, coming to you right here on Erica Vane TV with another True Detective Night Country video. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on your bell notifications so you don't miss out on any of my breakdowns, content, and conversations around this series. It is an enthralling, interesting, and sometimes confusing one, and I love having these conversations with you all. We start the episode 7 years ago, where Navarro presumably first meets Annie K while attempting to arrest her for trespassing at the mine. Annie is in the middle of helping another indigenous woman birth her baby, as she is a midwife, and refuses to let Navarro interrupt that. Thank goodness she didn't, because the baby had to be resuscitated upon delivery, proving the need for people like Annie, midwives, indigenous folks who have these birthing centers and practices, who happen to be being targeted and pushed out of spaces such as this fictitious Ennis, but in real life. And shout out to the official True Detective Night Country podcast, because they gave a ton of insights on how the real life, present day Alaska, indigenous communities in Alaska are being mirrored in this fictional Ennis version. A lot of the struggles, a lot of the socioeconomical issues are being highlighted in this series, and I think that they're doing a beautiful job of it. From there, we are ushered into the 5th day of night, present day, to the search party about to launch and look for Raymond Clark. Hank, for whatever reason, has been tasked with leading this part of the investigation, and we soon learn in this episode that he has some shady dealings tied to the people of Sasal and Annie's murder investigation from years ago. Hank calls for some outside help, which Navarro feels is a liability because they are literally just regular trigger-happy citizens of Ennis with shotguns, not actual additional police. This is supposed to be a task op, and it seems like Hank could care less about bringing Raymond Clark back alive, as he implies while providing directions to the entire search party. William Wheeler was the last case that Danvers worked on with Navarro, so she says, and it was a murder-suicide. Danvers lies to Pete, though, in telling him the story about William and saying that he was dead when they actually arrived to the scene, because during the flashback that is on screen at the time that she's having this conversation with Pete, we clearly get to see that he is not dead upon arrival, which to me implies that one of them actually took his life. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was Navarro, just because we know of her distinct and strong desire to protect women and her adverse feelings for women struggling within domestic situations. And given the fact that William Wheeler was an abuser, I totally could see Navarro losing it in a moment where they walk in and they see his girlfriend's body on the floor and he's just sitting there smiling, and she again potentially loses it. I think that that is the part that Danvers doesn't actually reveal to Pete, and that's more of the story and probably why they had to go their separate ways, because Danvers didn't necessarily want to turn Navarro in because she understood, but she doesn't want to work with her again. But I also still believe that there's more to the story when it comes to Danvers and Navarro. However, we are finally getting them to get on one accord, and it looks like they actually do work well together when they're not at each other's throats. And this shows up in one of the tidbits that Navarro is able to put together as they're going through all of the things from Raymond Clark's trailer. They come across one photo that looks like someone else was there and took it, and Navarro is able to make the connection by the blue dye that's actually left on it, and it's to Susan, the hairdresser, who actually is the one who took the candid photo. Danvers is able to, notably, before I go into Susan, is able to handle her daughter beautifully when her daughter interrupts this like faux interrogation. And I think that this is a call to Danvers' maternal side and her clear instincts that she still has even after losing her child and her husband. We're starting to see more and more of the maternal nature that Danvers naturally has, which is very interesting, especially when you see her engage with Leah in this episode, because the maternal nature is much more subdued. But the hairdresser said that Annie dreamed about the swirl tattoo that she has, but then once she got the tattoo, the dreams actually stopped for Annie, and this is the thing that drew Raymond in, and they met in that moment from that particular photo, and they kind of were like locked at the hip ever since. And while Annie seemed to be just as taken with Raymond as he was with her, it's communicated that Annie actually didn't want anybody to know that they were together, and that actually seemed weird to Susan. And Susan didn't really play up any of it because she was also dating a man from the station as well, Oliver Tagak, and he actually left before Annie passed away, and he was one of the equipment engineers, which this becomes a huge break, a huge clue to actually help, because aside from Raymond and Lund, the rest of the scientists from the station are frozen, i.e. dead. Now Navarro gives a little bit of smoke to Susan, because why wouldn't you say this when the investigation was actually going on? And then this is when the major bomb drops, in that Susan said that she did. She called the police and she wound up talking to Hank. But Hank didn't share that information, and then shortly after, he took Navarro off the case and happens to now be doing the manhunt with the search for Raymond Clark, whom he probably hopes winds up dead. I had an inkling that Hank had too much to hide before, but this made it crystal clear. And lucky for us, in this episode, we do get the payoff of getting to see them actually confront Hank. He happens to be at the ice rink talking to Pete when Navarro and Danvers walks in, and Navarro jumps in his face and points out the fact that he actually obstructed justice in not sharing the information about the case at that particular time. He is trying to attempt to dismiss Navarro, not speak to her, and then Danvers has to step in because it starts to get a little bit rocky, and he makes a point of saying, well, if you want to file a report against me for holding back this evidence, and maybe I should file a report against you for trying to play Mrs. Robinson with my kid. And he thought he ate, but he didn't. And just so we're clear, Mrs. Robinson is a term used to describe an older woman pursuing someone younger than herself, in reference to the character from the 1967 movie The Graduate. And I love that Danvers doesn't shake or stir just by him saying this. We have yet to see any kind of proof to corroborate it. It's interesting, the relationship and interaction that Pete and Danvers have, but we have yet to see them have anything inappropriate. If anything, it's given mentor-mentee. If anything, it's given mom and son. It's not necessarily given lovers. So I would be very surprised to see that become a thing if there is something going on. I think that Hank is really fueled by jealousy and misogyny when it comes to looking at Danvers, and knowing that he abuses Pete and they have the relationship that they have, and then seeing Pete actually revere Danvers in a way that he probably hopes that his son will look at him, but he can't possibly look at him in that way because he doesn't live up to that. It definitely bothers him. So I think that that's more so where this particular dig came from. In addition to him not actually being in a position of power, because it does feel like at some point Hank was the chief of police and now Danvers is. So in addition to the authority and the change in power at the actual police station, his son is actually looking more to her than he is to him. So of course it's going to ruffle a little bit of feathers. Now, after this scene, we get to see that Navarro goes to Kowtok to see if he knows Oliver, because they need to figure out who this man is. He's off the grid. And it's so interesting how he asks in exchange for finding out information about Oliver for her, that she tells him something about herself. And this forces her to storm out, refusing to do so. But you know that Navarro really cares about this case. She really wants to find justice for Annie and figure out what happened. So she quickly brings it on back, because she needs this information. And from this moment in this scene, we learn that her mother was a local, but she fell in love with a man and then moved them to Boston, hence her accent. Her dad was abusive, and her mother wound up taking them and running back to Alaska. Her mother was killed, and her murder was never found. And then this explains, at least in a little way, her devotion and empathy for women who are in domestic violence situations. And the one thing that stands out is that she was never told by her mom her Nupiaq name. And this comes up once we get to actually meet Oliver later on in the episode, and he asks, "Who are you?" And when she introduces herself, he's like, "Nah, who are you?" And she can't tell him her indigenous name because her mom never conveyed that to her. And this This weighs so heavy because this also perpetuates later on in the episode once you're dealing with Lund and the spirit takes over his body and comes back and is speaking on behalf of her mom. You can just feel the juxtaposition that Navarro is feeling and what she has actually perpetually been feeling, I guess, for the last 7 years since she actually met Annie, because she's a woman of the community, a police officer, but she's also indigenous to this community. So she understands everything that Annie was fighting for, everything that the people still are fighting for, because we actually get to see a rally in this episode. So she kind of gets torn, and with her not having what she might deem as a strong enough grasp to her indigenous roots or to knowledge of where she comes from and her place in it, it's very easy for her to not really ground herself in much of anything or go back and forth between the two and kind of get lost. And that is really what I felt in watching her in the hospital scene with Lund. But I'm going to get to that once we go through the rest of the episode. Now, from the scene with Oliver, because he asked them to leave after they reveal that your former co-workers are actually deceased and we're here because we need information. He does not have that. I think that this is not the last that we actually see of him, but he politely escorts them out on the other end of his shotgun and they go. But on the other side of town, Leah is going to a rally and she learns that there's another stillborn Avid Carter's child, and the locals are basically rallying and complaining about how the mine is poisoning their community. It is ruining everything, and these people have a lot of the same tattoos and markings that you get to see Annie with in various photos in the evidence that Danvers is reviewing throughout the first 2 episodes. So it's clear that they're all fighting for the same cause, or maybe Annie was a part of this group when she was actually alive, and they're still fighting 7 years later, and things are just getting worse, which is clear because for them to say another stillborn, it means that this is starting to become very, very regular, very, very prevalent, and it's a problem. And it's a very eerie, feeling or thing, because on the one end, if you will, the white side of Ennis is really strongly standing with the mine and the economy boost that it provides, and it funds the schools and it funds this and it funds that. Meanwhile, even when you go to, seeing Danvers go to the funeral for the stillborn, or maybe it's a repast, I'm not really sure of what they call it, but there's a moment where she goes into the bathroom, she's trying to gather herself and she turns on the water and the water comes out basically black and gray. Who can survive like that? So these people are here rallying to figure out how they're, I guess, going to fight back, how they're going to keep up the fight. And now Leah is thrown into it and she really identifies with it. It's a very interesting time for Leah to be exposed to all of this messaging and to these particular events, because she's in a place where she's deeply searching for who she is and to navigate her identity. And she's coming up against conflict when it comes to Danvers, because Danvers is very much so scared about Leah giving herself over basically to her indigenous roots. In a lot of ways, Leah starts to mirror and look almost identical to what Annie looks like, and that could totally be a mind for Danvers, which is probably why we see her react so crazily and making, Leah later on when she returns home to wash off the markings that she has on her face and basically trying to sever the tie that she is trying to build with her indigenous community, because she's so fearful for what comes with being a visible, vocal person in this community against the mines and doing what those people do. Air quotes, those people. And I loved in the podcast, so go and check out the official podcast, because they actually interviewed Jodie Foster and she talks about how racist Danvers is. And I love that she was able to call a thing, because specifically when it comes to how Danvers is handling Leah and the indigenous community, it is very much so given white fragility. It's very much so given racist undertones, and Jodie Foster was not afraid to call a thing with that, and I loved it. Jumping back over to when Navarro went to go see Kowtok, she actually hears as she's exiting, listen to her. And that's something that's said from some eerie voice, and then she sees a child with a one-eyed polar bear plush running in front of her, to which she starts to chase, and then she falls, and then we're taken back to that same war zone that we saw the flashback in episode 2, but this time it's just a really quick moment where that same child touches her shoulder. We get to see the polar bear again, and honestly the polar bear looks like the same polar bear that Danvers saw in episode 1, the toy on the floor after the child touched her arm. So now it's getting a little bit weird and creepy, because whose child is this? At first you thought it was Danvers' child, because we got to see, Navarro see the actual polar bear with the one eye in the episode. Meanwhile, Danvers saw the plush, and now Navarro is seeing the child with the plush toy, and it's not really clear who the child belongs to, or is this an indication that Navarro was there when Danvers lost her child, so that's why she has the visual as well, but that's not necessarily clear. I would love for y'all to share with me your thoughts about that in the comment section down below. Navarro's sister Julia in this episode has an episode and runs out of Kavix, winding up at this like really large, like immaculate, the set design and like the setups are freaking phenomenal in this series, but she winds up at this fossilized super huge shipwrecked boat that's sitting on the ice, and Navarro knew that she would be there. I think the significance of Navarro going to her is not really clear in the moment, but later on in the episode, when Lund rises after being sedated due to the massive injuries that he sustained and tells Navarro in the most cryptic tone, he says, "Hello, Evangeline. Your mother says hello. She's waiting for you." And this is distinctly different from the normal voice that he had moments before when he was talking to Danvers and revealed, "We woke her, and now she's out there in the ice. She came for us in the dark." I'm still navigating and processing and trying to figure out what that means, so I don't have any answers for y'all in reference to that. However, it is very clear that those were two different people coming from the same body, and it's alluded to that Lund actually dies because he kind of flatlines after he delivers that message to Navarro. And I would assume that that's what happens as well, because if Evangeline's mom is sending messages, and that means that person is passing a message from beyond, like, because her mom is dead. So I thought that Lund was going to die the moment that he said, "Your mother is waiting for you." It's like, okay, so if you are in communication or connection with her, then you are no longer in the land of the living yourself, or you're like making your way downtown, walking fast, faces past, and you're homebound. It's not funny, but that just came to mind. Back at home, Pete is having problems, and it's the same argument that we have seen perpetuate with him and his wife about him being at Danvers' beck and call, and she just wants her sweet idiot back, and he replies, "Well, what if I don't want to be a sweet idiot?" And that is the question of all questions, I think, when it comes to marriages. You meet somebody, you fall in love with somebody, you have a kid with somebody, get married with somebody, and sometimes, depending on at the age that you do all of this, you change because you're not necessarily settled into who you are and what you wanted to do. She said that she didn't marry a police officer, she married a sweet idiot, and he's like, "Well, I'm a police officer now, and I don't want to give it up." And I'm just like, ugh. It seems like there's real love there. However, this is definitely going to be a conflict that perpetuates and provides additional stress and strain to Pete as he's trying to navigate his career. It's interesting in this episode, and it wasn't super big. It was definitely subtle, but watching him navigate Navarro's presence almost from a place of trying to understand and get clarity on Danvers and Navarro's relationship, but low-key kind of having a little bit of resentment because Danvers really falls into a really easy flow with Navarro, and then she has the moments where she's able to find Oliver, which Pete wasn't able to do, and there's just certain things where you can just see that she's ahead, and then she keeps referring to him as freshman. It's like Pete is getting into a place where he's getting additional tension and conflict on both sides, and I wonder what he's going to do with all this pressure. But he does have a win in the episode because he gets his cousin, who's a veterinarian, to come and take a look at the bodies after the forensic scientist was not able to make it due to weather, and his cousin thinks that the men died before they actually froze because he said that this is not how you die from the cold. He believes that it's probably a cardiac arrest, noting that they look like some caribou that he had seen in the past who died while who died of fright while running. And that is a call to the very first scene in the very first episode of this season. So I love that, like, full circle moment. I think the way that they use sound, specifically the indigenous sound, so aside from William, who was whistling at the murder scene 7 years ago, there are quite a few moments in this episode where sound and song from the indigenous people is very, very prevalent, such as, you know, at the rally or at the funeral. And I haven't figured out the specific significance of each of these moments of like heightened sound and the indigenous people's use of it, but I definitely wanted to note it in this breakdown because I think that it's important. I just haven't figured out how and why yet. That is my recap and my review for episode 3 from season 4 of True Detective. Look out for new videos. I will be doing a predictions video for episode 4. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out when I post that, and then I will dive into specific story elements and character conversations throughout the week so that we can keep this conversation going. Please let me know all of your thoughts, theories, and predictions in the comment section down below. I'm so excited to continue this conversation about this amazing show with y'all. The series is getting better and better and better, but it started out beautifully, so it's incredible to see it just continue to take us on this amazing ride. It's your good sis you love to talk TV with, and I'm gonna see you in the next one.